In the heart of Chicago, where glass towers clawed at the sky, one name was spoken in the hushed, reverent tones usually reserved for approaching thunderstorms: Alistair Finch. He didn't build buildings. He forged monoliths of steel and ambition, monuments to a ruthless perfectionism. His fortune was a skyline he had personally authored, but his temper was a demolition ball, capable of leveling careers and crushing the human spirit in a single, ice-cold tirade. From city planners to the hard-hatted foremen on his sites, everyone learned to orbit him at a safe distance. They deferred, they acquiesced, they endured. They never, ever pushed back. Until a Wednesday evening at Aura, the city's most astronomically expensive restaurant, when a 22-year-old waitress named Clara Mayhew, with cheap, sensible shoes and a soul worn down by the friction of a thankless life, decided the architect of the city had finally met a foundation that refused to crack. This is not a love story. This is the story of the day the hurricane met the bedrock. Aura wasn't merely a place to eat. It was a stage, a silent auction of power and influence held nightly beneath a ceiling of hand-blown glass that mimicked a celestial nebula. The very air was curated, thick with the scent of saffron risotto, vintage Bordeaux, and the unspoken weight of billion-dollar handshakes. For the staff, it was a grueling performance of anticipatory servitude, of becoming elegantly invisible. And tonight, the lead in this opulent drama was Alistair Finch. His entrance sent a palpable tremor through the dining room. Mr. Laurent, the maître d', whose composure was legendary, suddenly found a desperate need to adjust his tie. The soft clinking of cutlery seemed to falter. Alistair Finch didn't just take a table. He annexed it. He sat alone at his preferred corner booth, a predator in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored, it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. The danger in Alistair wasn't in volume. It was in his unnerving stillness, the predatory economy of his movements. His eyes, the color of wet slate, missed nothing and forgave even less. They were the eyes of a man who could spot a hairline fracture in a steel beam from 100 yards away. Clara Mayhew was 4 hours into a 12-hour double shift. Her feet throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, a constant reminder of the 2 bus transfers and the miles she walked across the polished marble each night. Her mind, however, was in a small, stuffy apartment on the west side, where her grandmother, Eleanor, was fighting a quiet, losing battle with emphysema. The mountain of medical bills was Everest, and her job at Aura was the only ice axe she had. Every polite smile, every refilled water glass, was another inch gained against the summit of their debt. So when Mr. Laurent approached her, his face a pale mask of professional dread, she knew the ground was about to give way. "Clara," he whispered, his French accent thick with anxiety. "Mr. Finch's section. Daniel has developed a sudden migraine. You are the most observant on the floor. You know the protocol." Clara's heart didn't sink. It plummeted. The Finch protocol, an unwritten manual for surviving the architect. No extraneous conversation. Water glass filled to precisely 3/4, never more. Silverware must be perfectly parallel to the edge of the table. He would order the seared scallops, followed by the dry-aged ribeye, cooked Pittsburgh rare. A bottle of Screaming Eagle Cabernet, opened at the table, but left to breathe for exactly 15 minutes before pouring. Never, under any circumstances, ask if he is enjoying his meal. You simply watch, you wait, you vanish. She took a deep, fortifying breath, her professional mask clicking into place. Of course, Mr. Laurent. Her initial approach was a masterclass in self-effacement. She presented the wine with a surgeon's steady hand. He didn't look up, his gaze locked on a set of architectural blueprints spread across the table. She placed the bread, a single, warm brioche roll, his preference, on its designated plate. Nothing. She retreated, her movements as silent as a shadow. For the next hour, the grim ballet continued. She served his scallops. She served his steak, which she had personally watched the chef sear to a perfect char on the outside while leaving the inside cool and red. She was clearing the plates from an adjacent table of laughing tourists when she heard it. Not a shout, but a low, controlled sound that was infinitely more chilling. The quiet, deliberate tap, tap, tap of a fork against the table's edge. It was a summons. Her stomach coiled into a knot. She turned. Alistair Finch was staring not at his steak, but at the table itself. He had taken only a single bite of his meal. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet hers, and the cold indifference she'd seen earlier was gone. A glacial fire was burning in his slate-grey eyes. "Is there a problem with your steak, sir?" Clara asked, her voice a practiced neutral murmur. He ignored the question, his focus still on the table. "This table," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "It has a wobble. A minuscule, almost imperceptible deviation in the vertical integrity of the leg. Did you notice?" Clara froze. Of all the things she had prepared for, this was not one. I apologize, sir. I did not." "Of course you didn't," he sneered, the word dripping with contempt. "People like you don't see. You look, but you don't see. You exist in a world of surfaces, of accepted imperfections." He pushed his plate away, the motion sharp and dismissive. "I am paying $400 for this piece of meat. I am paying for an experience that is flawless, an environment of structural and aesthetic perfection, and I am being asked to dine at a table that is fundamentally compromised. It's an insult. It's an insult to the design of this room, and it's an insult to me." Mr. Laurent was now hovering nearby, wringing his hands. The nearby tables had fallen into a tomb-like silence. Clara felt a hot, coiling serpent of anger begin to rise from the pit of her stomach. It was the same helpless fury she felt when the insurance company denied another claim for Eleanor's oxygen machine. But here, in this temple of obscene privilege, it felt different. It felt personal. He wasn't just critiquing a table. He was critiquing her entire existence, her inability to perceive the world with his level of divine clarity. "I will move you to another table immediately, sir," she said, her training desperately trying to reassert control. "No," he snapped. "The moment is ruined. The integrity of the entire evening has been fractured. I want you to understand the cascading effect of such a small failure." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "It starts with a wobbly table. Then the chef gets complacent. The service slips. The standards erode. It is the architectural equivalent of cancer, a single weak point threatening the entire edifice. Do you comprehend the magnitude of your oversight?" And in that moment, something inside Clara Mayhew, something that had been compressed by debt, worry, and the daily humiliation of serving the whims of the wealthy, finally broke. It wasn't a conscious act of rebellion. It was a seismic shift, a tectonic plate of her soul that had endured too much pressure. She looked from his cold, imperious face to the offending table. She thought of Eleanor, struggling for every breath with a quiet dignity this man could never fathom. She thought of her own dreams, of being an artist, of sketching portraits that captured the truth of a person's soul, a dream she'd packed away like a childhood toy. She thought of the condescending smiles and casual cruelties she absorbed every single day, all to keep her grandmother alive. and she had had enough. With a slow, deliberate movement, she knelt beside the table. Her colleagues stared, horrified. Mr. Laurent looked as if he might actually faint. Alistair Finch watched her, a flicker of confused curiosity momentarily replacing his rage. Clara ran her hand along the base of the table leg, feeling for the source of the infinitesimal wobble. Then she reached into her apron pocket, past her order pad and pens, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper from her pocket, a discarded sketch of a man on the bus she'd been working on earlier. With meticulous care, she folded it one more time, creating a small, dense square. She slid it precisely under the offending leg. She stood up and placed her hand on the table, pressing down firmly. It was as solid as granite. She then looked Alistair Finch directly in the eye. Her voice, when it came, was shockingly calm and clear, cutting through the cavernous silence of the restaurant. "Your steak is perfect," she began. "This room is beautiful. The only thing in this entire establishment with a fundamental flaw is you." A collective, strangled gasp rippled through the nearby diners. "You see," she continued, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am an observer too, Mr. Finch. I see the stress in your jaw that has nothing to do with this restaurant. I see the weariness in your eyes that no amount of money can fix. You're not angry about the table. The table is just a place for you to hang your own brokenness. You come in here and you wield your temper like a weapon, not because you demand perfection, but because you are terrified of the imperfection you see every morning in the mirror. It must be a terribly lonely way to build a world." She began to untie the strings of her apron, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve absolute. "You are a brilliant architect of buildings, sir, but you have engineered a life that is hollow, and I will not spend one more minute of my own life propping it up." She laid the folded apron neatly on the now perfectly stable table. "My apologies for the oversight." She straightened her back, a waitress earning $17 an hour, looking at a man worth $17 billion. "And I quit." She turned and walked away, leaving behind a stunned billionaire, a perfectly balanced table, and the deafening silence of a performance that had been irrevocably, magnificently rewritten. As she pushed through the kitchen doors into the welcome chaos of clattering pans and shouting chefs, she didn't feel fear. For the first time in years, she felt the soaring, terrifying thrill of integrity. She had no way of knowing that her small act of structural correction hadn't ended her story with Alistair Finch. It had just laid the foundation. The euphoria of defiance has a notoriously short half-life. It powered Clara through the stunned silence of the kitchen, past a ghostly pale Mr. Laurent who could only stare, and out into the crisp Chicago night. It even sustained her through the 2 bus rides home, a triumphant soldier retreating from a battle she hadn't known she was going to fight. But defiance, she was brutally reminded the next morning, doesn't pay for prescription refills. It doesn't cover the rent, and it certainly couldn't appease the landlord who had already sent 2 politely worded but firm notices. By noon, the cold, grey reality of a Chicago autumn had seeped into her small apartment and into her bones. She was unemployed. Worse, she was likely blacklisted. The world of high-end hospitality in Chicago was a tight-knit village. The story of the waitress who had psychoanalyzed Alistair Finch over a wobbly table would spread like wildfire. Who would possibly hire her now? She spent the afternoon in a state of quiet panic, sketching in her worn notebook, the only thing that calmed her nerves. She drew the faces she saw from her window, a tired mother pushing a stroller, a businessman talking furiously into his phone, an old man feeding pigeons. She tried to capture the stories in their eyes, the tiny lines of worry or joy that most people overlooked. It was her secret language, this art of seeing. But it wasn't a language that paid the bills. Just as a genuine wave of despair was about to pull her under, the intercom buzzed, a harsh, jarring sound in the quiet apartment. She wasn't expecting anyone. Assuming it was a mistaken delivery, she pressed the talk button. Yes? A calm, measured baritone voice, impossibly clear through the cheap speaker, replied. Miss Clara Mayhew? My name is Julian Croft. I am calling on behalf of Mr. Alistair Finch. Clara's blood turned to ice. This was it. He'd sent his lawyer. She was being sued for slander, for emotional damages, for apron-related insubordination. Her defiant speech replayed in her mind, and every word now sounded like a potential lawsuit. I have nothing to say to Mr. Finch, she stammered. He is not asking you to speak, Miss Mayhew, the voice replied, unflappable. He is requesting a moment of your time. I can assure you it is not what you expect. May I come up? Against every instinct screaming at her to run, a sliver of morbid curiosity, the same observational impulse that got her into this mess, won out. What could the man who had everything possibly want from the woman who had just gleefully thrown it all away? She buzzed him in. The man who appeared at her door a minute later was the antithesis of Alistair Finch. Where Finch was a storm of dark, kinetic energy, Julian Croft was an island of tranquility. He was in his late 60s, with kind, crinkling eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a neatly trimmed silver beard, and a simple tweed jacket that spoke of quiet, old-world quality. He held a simple leather portfolio, not as a weapon, but as an afterthought. Miss Mayhew, he said, with a small, genuine smile. Thank you for seeing me. I'm not sure I had a choice, she replied, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. Her small apartment, usually her sanctuary, felt shabby and exposed under his polite gaze. Oh, one always has a choice, Julian said, his eyes taking in her sketches pinned to a corkboard on the wall. He paused, looking at a particularly striking charcoal portrait of an elderly woman, her face a roadmap of a long life. That's quite remarkable. You capture not just the likeness but the character. Clara was taken aback. It's my grandmother. I just doodle. No, he said softly, turning back to her. You see, which is precisely why I'm here. Mr. Finch was intrigued. Clara let out a short, sharp laugh. Intrigued? I publicly humiliated him and walked out on my job. What's intriguing about that? Your diagnosis, Julian stated simply, and your solution. Mr. Finch is surrounded by men and women paid millions of dollars to solve complex problems. They bring him data, projections, and strategies. You brought him a folded piece of paper and the truth. He finds that efficient. He opened his portfolio. He is prepared to offer you a position. Clara stared at him, convinced this was some bizarre, labyrinthine form of revenge. A position? Doing what? Polishing his shoes? Checking every table in the city for structural integrity? A warm smile touched Julian's lips. A consultant. On a specific, ongoing project. He slid a single sheet of paper from the portfolio and placed it on her cluttered coffee table. It was a contract for a short-term consultancy. Clara looked at the weekly fee stipulated at the bottom, and her breath caught in her throat. The amount for 1 week was more than she made in 3 months at Aura. It was enough to cover Eleanor's medical bills for the rest of the year. It was a parachute, a golden silk-spun parachute, offered by the very man who had pushed her out of the plane. The sheer whiplash of it was dizzying. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What could I possibly consult on? I'm a waitress who draws. "The Helios Tower," Julian said. "It is Mr. Finch's crowning achievement, his legacy project. Architecturally, it is perfect, a masterpiece of engineering and design. But it is failing. Failing how? In the human sense," Julian explained. "The retail spaces on the ground floor are struggling. The residents of the luxury condos above seem isolated. The public plaza we built as a gift to the city is sterile, empty. There is no life, no soul. Mr. Finch has had teams of market analysts and urban planners look at it. They've produced 1,000 pages of data, but they can't identify the core problem. He believes they are looking, but not seeing." He gestured to her sketches on the wall. "He wants you to see. He wants you to walk the plaza, to sit in the cafes, to observe the people. He wants you to tell him where the floor is. Not in the steel, but in the spirit of the place." The offer was as terrifying as it was tempting. It felt like a trap, wrapped in the prettiest paper she had ever seen. "This is a test, isn't it? He's setting me up to fail, to prove that my little speech was just a fluke." Julian's expression grew serious. "I have worked for Alistair Finch for 40 years. I knew him when he was a driven young man who believed architecture could save the world. He is difficult, demanding, and often a prisoner of his own impossible standards. But he is not frivolous. Revenge is an inefficient waste of resources. This is not about revenge, Miss Mayhew. This is an experiment. He is a man who trusts blueprints and stress tests. You presented him with a form of data he does not understand, and it unnerved him. He wants to know if it's real." He gestured to the contract. "The offer is genuine. The first week's fee will be paid in advance upon signing. As I said, you have a choice." Clara looked at the contract, at the impossible number written on it. She pictured Eleanor's labored breathing, the fear in her eyes every time she looked at the pile of bills. Could she swallow her pride? Could she agree to work for the tyrant, the man who embodied the casual cruelty of the world she despised? Her pride was a luxury. Eleanor's next breath was not. She picked up a pen from the coffee table, her hand surprisingly steady. "What do I need to do?" Julian Croft gave her that small, knowing smile again. "Be at the Helios Tower tomorrow morning at 9, and bring your sketchbook. Welcome to the project, Miss Mayhew." As he left, Clara was left alone with the contract and the sickening, exhilarating feeling that she hadn't just accepted a job. She had accepted a dare. She was being asked to walk into the heart of the lion's creation, not to serve him, but to find the flaw in its heart. She just hoped she wouldn't get eaten alive in the process. The Helios Tower was less a building and more a declaration of war against the sky. It rose 100 stories from the heart of downtown Chicago, a twisting column of obsidian glass and burnished steel that seemed to drink the sunlight. The lobby was a cathedral of white marble and cavernous silence, designed to make any human being feel small and insignificant. Clara, dressed in her only professional-looking black blazer, felt like a field mouse in a palace of eagles. The contract in her purse felt less like an opportunity and more like the price of her soul. Julian Croft met her in the lobby, his calm demeanor a welcome anchor in the intimidating space. He led her not up the elevators, but out onto the sprawling public plaza at the tower's base. "This is it," he said, with a sweeping gesture. The heart of the problem. It was, as he'd said, architecturally perfect, a vast expanse of precisely cut granite, interspersed with geometric planters, sleek wooden benches, and a magnificent modern sculpture that resembled a frozen waterfall. It was clean, elegant, and utterly devoid of life. A few tourists took photos and left. A handful of office workers hurried across it, their heads down, their paths straight and efficient. No one lingered. No one sat on the beautiful benches. The plaza felt like a museum exhibit of a public space, not the real thing. "Mr. Finch is observing from his office," Julian said, gesturing up at the impossibly high penthouse floors. "He will not interfere. Your instructions are simple. Observe. Talk to people. Sketch. Understand why this perfect space feels so wrong. You have 1 week." For the first 2 days, Clara simply existed in the space. She sat on the cold benches, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. She sketched the architecture, the sharp angles, the interplay of light and shadow, and she sketched the people. The few who crossed the plaza moved with a strange sense of purpose, as if they were trespassing. They hugged the edges, avoiding the wide-open center. It felt less like a town square and more like a no-man's land. She started talking to people. She spoke to a harried barista in the soulless cafe at the plaza's edge. "Business is slow," the young woman admitted. "People grab their coffee and run. No one hangs out." She spoke to a security guard. "It's too quiet," he said. "Eerie. My old post in the park. There was always something going on. Kids, music, old guys playing chess. Here, nothing." On the 3rd day, she ventured into the surrounding neighborhood, a vibrant, older part of the city, with brick-fronted shops and family-owned restaurants that the Helios Tower now overshadowed. Here, the streets were alive. People laughed. They greeted each other. They sat at sidewalk tables. She spoke to Maria, the owner of a small Italian bakery that had been there for 60 years. "That place?" Maria said, gesturing with her flour-dusted hands towards the tower. "It's beautiful, I suppose. But it's not for us. It's cold. It looks down on us. It blocked the morning sun from my shop, you know. For 40 years, the sun would hit my cannolis just so. Now, just a shadow." Clara sketched Maria's face, capturing the pride and the hint of sadness in her eyes. It was then that the first piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The Helios Tower wasn't integrated with the community. It had been imposed upon it. The plaza wasn't a gift. It was a border, a sterile buffer zone between the world of Alistair Finch and the real world. She spent the next 2 days documenting this disconnect. She sketched the flow of foot traffic, noticing how people would walk 3 extra blocks to avoid the plaza's empty expanse. She noted the lack of any shelter from the brutal Chicago wind that whipped between the tall buildings. The perfect benches were aesthetically pleasing, but ergonomically punishing, designed for looking at, not sitting on. The magnificent sculpture was intimidating, not inviting. It was a space designed by a man who understood structure, but not people. At the end of the week, Julian summoned her to the top floor. The private elevator ascended in unnerving silence, opening directly into Alistair Finch's office. The room was breathtaking and terrifying. It was a minimalist expanse of concrete and glass, with a 360-degree view of the city. Alistair Finch stood with his back to her, looking down at his creation like a god observing his flawed world. "Report," he commanded, without turning around. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a breath and laid her sketchbook on the massive empty desk. She didn't have charts or graphs. She had faces. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice steady. "Your plaza isn't failing because it's flawed. It's failing because it's perfect." He turned slowly, one eyebrow raised in skeptical disdain. "That's a meaningless, sentimental platitude. Explain." "You designed a space to be looked at," she said, flipping open her sketchbook. "But a public space needs to be lived in. Your benches are sculptures, but they're too wide and too cold to sit on comfortably for more than 5 minutes." She showed him a sketch of a man perched awkwardly on the edge of one. Your open space is magnificent, but it offers no protection from the wind, no sense of intimacy. People feel exposed, so they stick to the edges. She showed him a diagram she'd drawn of pedestrian flow, like ants avoiding the center of a plate. "And this," she said, turning to the portrait of Maria, the baker. "This is the real problem. The plaza feels arrogant. It ignores the neighborhood it lives in. It casts a shadow, literally and figuratively. It doesn't invite people in. It keeps them out. It's a beautiful, perfectly engineered wall." Alistair walked over to the desk, his slate-grey eyes scanning her sketches. He was silent for a long time, his face unreadable. He stopped at the portrait of Maria. "Sentiment," he finally said, his voice laced with dismissal. "The ramblings of a nostalgic shopkeeper. This has nothing to do with pedestrian flow analytics or commercial viability." "It has everything to do with it," Clara countered, her frustration overriding her fear. "You can't just build a monument to yourself and expect people to worship it. You have to give them a reason to love it. You have to give it a heart." "A heart," he scoffed, turning away. "Buildings don't have hearts, Miss Mayhew. They have foundations. They have structural integrity. The rest is just decoration." "And that's why it's failing," she said, her voice rising. "Because you see people as decoration. You built a perfect body, but it has no soul, and people can feel that. They know when something is hollow." He spun back to face her, the cold fire returning to his eyes. "You were hired to provide an observation, not a lecture on philosophy. Your analysis is noted, and it is rejected. It is amateur, emotional, and useless. You have fulfilled your contract. Julian will see you out." He turned his back on her, a final, brutal dismissal. Clara stood there, stunned and shaking with anger. All that work, all that insight, dismissed in an instant. She had been a fool to think she could make a difference, to think he would actually listen. He was exactly the man she'd met in the restaurant, arrogant, cold, and imprisoned by his own rigid worldview. She gathered her sketchbook from his desk, but as she turned to leave, a glint of light from a small, framed photograph on a side table caught her eye. It was turned face down. A flicker of the same defiant curiosity that had guided her all week made her pause. While his back was still turned, she reached out and gently turned it over. It was an old, faded photo of a much younger Alistair, smiling, with his arm around an older, kind-faced man. They were standing on a construction site in front of a half-finished bridge. The pride in the younger Alistair's face was radiant, but it was the inscription at the bottom that made the air leave her lungs. "Westgate Bridge, 1982. With Dad. My first foundation." Westgate Bridge. The name echoed in her memory from late-night internet searches she'd done on him. The Westgate Bridge. The infamous, catastrophic failure. A structural collapse during its final phase of construction that had killed 12 workers, including its chief engineer, a man named Michael Finch, Alistair's father. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. His obsession with perfection, his terror of the smallest flaw, his dismissal of the human element. He wasn't an arrogant god. He was a terrified child, still standing in the rubble of his father's greatest failure. His entire career, his entire life, was a frantic, desperate attempt to build something so perfect, so flawless, that it could never, ever fall down and hurt anyone again. His coldness wasn't arrogance, it was armor. He turned, sensing her stillness. "I told you to leave." Clara looked from the photograph to his hard, guarded face. The anger had vanished from her, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. "The flaw isn't in the plaza, is it?" she said softly. "It's in the foundation. Your foundation. It cracked a long time ago, didn't it? At Westgate. The name hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face. The armor disintegrated, and for a single, breathtaking moment, she saw the raw, unguarded grief he had encased in steel and concrete for 40 years. "Get out," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Get out. Now." This time she listened. She walked out of the office, her heart aching for the man she had, moments before, despised. She had been hired to find a flaw in his building. Instead, she had found the one in his soul. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the hollow plaza was just a symptom. The real disease was the ghost of a fallen bridge, and it was about to bring Alistair Finch's entire world crashing down. The following Monday, Clara was back in her apartment, the generous consultancy fee deposited in her bank account. It was enough to give her and Eleanor breathing room for months, a small island of security in a sea of uncertainty. But the victory felt hollow. The image of Alistair Finch's face when she'd mentioned Westgate was seared into her mind. She had stumbled upon the source code of his pain, and the knowledge was a heavy burden. She tried to move on, applying for jobs at cafes and diners far from the city centre. But her mind kept drifting back to the Helios Plaza. She saw it not as a failure of architecture, but as a monument to a man's grief. She found herself sketching ideas for the space in her notebook. Not grand, architectural changes, but small, human ones. A cluster of smaller, movable tables and chairs to create intimacy. A vendor cart selling hot chestnuts in the winter. A local artist painting portraits. A small stage for musicians from the neighborhood. Things that would give it a heart. Late that week, her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello? Miss Mayhew, it's Julian Croft." His voice was grave. "I need to ask you to come back to the office. Something has happened." An hour later, she was standing once again in the minimalist fortress of Alistair Finch's office. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The usual intimidating calm was replaced by a palpable tension. Alistair was not looking out the window. He was seated at his massive desk, staring at a formal-looking document. He looked diminished. The formidable energy was gone, replaced by a weary exhaustion. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice flat. He gestured to the document. "This is an injunction, filed this morning by a coalition of community groups and business owners from the district surrounding the Helios." "What does it say?" Clara asked. "It's a petition to the city's zoning board," Julian explained, stepping forward. "They are demanding a halt to the second phase of the Helios project, the construction of the Community Arts Centre. They are citing structural concerns, negative environmental impact, and a litany of other fabricated issues." "But why?" "Because of him," Alistair said, sliding a glossy magazine across the desk. The cover featured a smiling, handsome man in a perfectly tailored suit, with the headline, "Marcus Thorne, the People's Developer." "Thorne has been buying up property in that neighborhood for years," Alistair continued, his voice a low growl. "He wants to build his own tower there. He's been waiting for me to fail. He's the one funding this community coalition. He's poisoning the well, turning my own project against me." "He's using your own methods against you," Clara said softly, realizing the brutal irony. "He's found a flaw and is exploiting it." Alistair looked up at her, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes, only a grudging respect. "Yes, he has. He's framing me as the out-of-touch corporate villain, and himself as the champion of the little guy. The city council meeting is in 2 weeks. If they grant the injunction, the project will be tied up in litigation for years. Thorne wins." "So fight back," Clara said. Show them your data, your engineering reports. Prove them wrong." "It's not about data anymore," Alistair said, a bitter edge to his voice. "Thorn has made it about emotion, about perception, a battle I am ill-equipped to fight." He looked down at his hands. "He has made it about heart." The word hung in the air between them, the very thing he had dismissed her for. "I am going to lose," Alistair said, the admission seeming to cost him a great deal. "I am going to lose my legacy project because I do not understand the people it is for." A long silence filled the room. Clara looked at the man before her, a titan of industry brought to his knees, not by a market crash or a rival corporation, but by a bakery owner's sadness over her lost morning son. "No, you're not," she said, the words coming out before she had even consciously decided to say them. Alistair and Julian both looked at her. "You're not going to fight him with data," Clara continued, her mind racing, the ideas from her sketchbook suddenly coalescing into a coherent strategy. "You're going to fight him with the truth. Not your truth, theirs." She tapped the magazine cover. "Marcus Thorne is selling a story. We just need to tell a better one, a more honest one." "And how do we do that?" Alistair asked, a flicker of his old skepticism returning. "You stop building," Clara said, "and you start listening. You give me 1 week. No, give me 10 days. Let me go back there, not as your consultant, just as me. Let me talk to them. Let me draw them. Let me understand what they've lost, and what they're afraid of losing. And let me find out what Thorne is promising them." "It's a fool's errand," Alistair scoffed. "They won't talk to anyone associated with me." "They won't know I am," she said. "I'm just a girl with a sketchbook. People tell things to artists they'd never tell a suit." She looked him directly in the eye. "You hired me to find a flaw. I found it. Now let me help you fix it. Not with concrete, with trust." Alistair stared at her, a complex battle of pride and desperation playing out across his features. He had built an empire on the principles of control and unyielding strength. She was asking him to surrender, to trust in the intangible, emotional woo. The cavernous silence of the city council chamber was a physical weight. It was heavier than concrete, more oppressive than the lowest level of a parking garage. For 10 days, Clara had operated on a current of defiant energy, a blend of adrenaline and righteousness. Now, standing behind Alistair Finch as he faced the council, that current died, leaving her stranded in a terrifying quiet. He had dismissed his phalanx of lawyers. He had pushed aside the mountain of data that was his usual arsenal. He was armed with nothing but her charcoal portraits and a truth he had spent 40 years entombing. Marcus Thorne's presentation had been a masterpiece of polished aggression. He'd wielded the community's fear like a scalpel, making precise, damaging cuts. Now, Alistair approached the podium, his steps unnervingly measured on the marble floor. He looked smaller without his usual armor of fury. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. He placed his hands on the lectern, his knuckles white. He did not look at the council members, draped in their robes of civic authority. He did not look at Thorne, who was smirking with the predatory confidence of a wolf that had already tasted blood. He turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the public gallery until it found them. Maria, her baker's hands, knotted in her lap. Mr. Chen, his tailor's posture ramrod straight, a mask of dignity over a lifetime of quiet worry. Sophia, the daycare owner, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. "My name is Alistair Finch." His voice was not the familiar baritone of command. It was rougher, lower, like stone grinding against stone. "I have spent my professional life in the pursuit of perfection. I believed that a flawless structure was the highest goal one could achieve. I believed that strength was measured in tensile resistance and load-bearing capacity. I believed that any deviation, any imperfection, was a catastrophic failure. He paused, and the silence in the room deepened, becoming attentive. This was not the speech anyone had expected. I was wrong. The admission was not loud, but it cracked the foundation of the room. The life's work I have built, this city's skyline. It is a testament to a profound and long-held misunderstanding. A structure is not measured by its ability to stand. It is measured by the life it holds. By that metric, the Helios Plaza, my legacy, is a failure. Because I did not design it for life, I designed it against my fear. His eyes, those wet slate instruments of brutal assessment, were fixed on Maria. "I did not see you," he said, his voice dropping, becoming a conversation in a crowded room. "I saw a variable to be managed. I did not hear your concerns. I heard noise that interfered with the purity of my design, the shadow my building cast on your bakery, on your life. It was, to me, an unfortunate but necessary geometric consequence. For that arrogance, for that blindness, I am sorry." He then looked at Mr. Chen and Sophia and the others. "I am sorry," he repeated, and the words, so simple, were a demolition. He was raising his own legend, right here, in public. He spoke of the Westgate Bridge. He did not embellish or ask for pity. He laid out the facts with the cold precision of an engineering report, but the data points were fragments of a boy's heart. His father, the flaw in the steel, the sound of the collapse, the silence that followed. He explained that he had spent 4 decades trying to build a world with no cracks, a world where nothing could ever fall again. "I built a fortress," he concluded, his voice raw, "when what your neighborhood needed was a hearth. Mr. Thorne offers you promises. I have learned the hard way that my promises are worthless until they are proven. So I will not make any. I will only ask, what do you need? What does your community need to heal the wound that I have inflicted upon it?" Thorne was on his feet, sputtering about procedure, about relevance. But the council chair, an older woman with tired, intelligent eyes, simply raised a hand, silencing him. The room was no longer a hearing. It had become a confessional. Clara felt a tremor in her hands. This was the moment. She walked to the front, her sensible shoes making no sound. She did not look at Thorne or the council. She set up the easel and placed her portfolio upon it. One by one, she revealed the portraits. "Mr. Thorne has presented you with a narrative of victimization," she said, her voice clear and calm, cutting through the emotional thickness in the air. "I would like to present you with people." Her voice became a quiet river, flowing around the images. She spoke of Maria's 60 years of pride, the way the morning sun used to catch the sugar on the cannolis. She spoke of Mr. Chen's hands, hands that had mended the clothes of 3 generations of families. She spoke of Sophia's dream for a safe place for the neighborhood's children to play. She didn't have to raise her voice. The faces in the portraits did the shouting for her. They were filled with a truth more powerful than any legal argument. Then, with surgical precision, she exposed the poison pills in Thorne's relocation agreements, the vague language in his contracts. She wasn't just defending Alistair. She was defending the people he had finally seen. The final move was Alistair's. He stepped forward again, a different man from the one who had first approached the podium. The confession had not broken him. It seemed to have forged him into something new. "I am formally withdrawing my proposal for the Helios Arts Center," he announced. The room gasped. "In its place, I am establishing the Helios Neighborhood Trust, seeded with an initial endowment of $50 million. The purpose of this trust will be to fund and develop projects that serve this community, as defined by this community. Its board will not be appointed by me. It will be elected by the residents and business owners of this district. They will control the land. They will control the funds. They will build their own future. He looked directly at Thorne, and for the first time, a flicker of the old, dangerous Alistair Finch appeared, but it was tempered with something else. Not arrogance, but authority. An authority earned through sacrifice. Your move, Marcus. It was checkmate. The air went out of Thorne's case. He had built his platform on being the community's champion, and in a single, stunning act of surrender, Alistair had handed the community the crown. The council's vote was a mere formality. The ride up the silent elevator to the penthouse was the longest journey of Clara's life. Alistair stood in the corner, his back to her and Julian, staring at his reflection in the polished steel. He looked like a man who had survived a plane crash, stunned and disoriented, unsure how to process the fact that he was still alive on solid ground. The victory in the council chamber hadn't felt triumphant. It had felt grave. Like the signing of a treaty after a long and bloody war. When the doors opened into the vast, minimalist office, he didn't move. He just stood there, facing the panoramic view of the city he had conquered. But his posture was not that of a king surveying his realm. It was the posture of a man seeing it for the first time and realizing he didn't know it at all. The board will require a director, Julian said softly into the silence, his voice gentle. Someone to act as a liaison. Someone who understands both worlds. Someone they trust. Alistair turned slowly. His face was a grey mask of exhaustion. The deep lines around his eyes seemed to have been carved there in the last 2 hours. He looked at Clara, and his gaze was stripped of all its former power and condescension. It was simply the look of one human being seeing another. "The job is yours if you want it," he said. His voice was hoarse. "The salary, the terms, whatever you want. Write your own contract." A year ago, the offer would have been a lifeline, a fantasy beyond her wildest dreams. Now it felt like an anchor, threatening to pull her down into depths she wasn't sure she could navigate. She would be the bridge between this man of impossible wealth and the community he had almost crushed. The pressure would be immense, the potential for failure colossal. "I'm an artist," she said, the words feeling thin and inadequate in the cavernous space. "I don't know how to run a trust fund." "You are not an artist, Miss Mayhew," Alistair corrected her, his voice regaining a sliver of its old precision. "You are an observer. You see the cracks, you see the stress points, not in steel but in people. That is a rarer and more valuable skill than you can possibly imagine. I built a billion-dollar tower that is fundamentally unsound. You fixed a wobbly table with a piece of scrap paper. Of the two of us, who do you think is the more qualified engineer of things that matter?" He walked to his desk and collapsed into his chair, the first time she had ever seen him sit in her presence. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. "I have spent my entire life giving orders," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "I don't know how to listen. You will have to teach me." And in that moment, Clara understood. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a plea. He hadn't just ceded control of a parcel of land. He had surrendered a part of himself, and he was terrified of what would rush in to fill the void. He needed a translator, a guide. "All right," she said, her own voice quiet but firm. "I'll do it, but on one condition." Alistair looked up, a flicker of surprise in his tired eyes. "My office won't be in this tower," she stated. "It will be on their side of the plaza. And you will attend the monthly board meetings, in person. Not as a benefactor, not as the man who signs the checks, but as a resident of the city, to listen." For a long moment, he was silent. She had just given her new billionaire boss his first order. Julian Croft's expression was unreadable, but a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. Alistair Finch gave a single, slow nod. "As I said, you will have to teach me." The first few months were chaotic. The Helios Neighborhood Trust was born not in a sterile boardroom, but in the noisy, fluorescent-lit basement of the local community center. The meetings were a cacophony of competing interests and long-held grievances. Mr. Chen wanted subsidies for the legacy businesses. Sophia wanted a state-of-the-art playground. A dozen other voices clamored for a new library, a community garden, affordable housing. They were a fragile coalition, held together by a common enemy, Marcus Thorne, who had since vanished from the scene, and a common, distrustful benefactor. Clara felt utterly out of her depth. Her sketchbook was her only anchor. While they argued, she drew them. She sketched the passion in their faces, the frustration in their body language, the hope that flickered beneath the anger. Her drawings became the minutes of the meetings, capturing the emotional truth that the official transcripts missed. True to his word, Alistair attended every meeting. He would arrive with Julian, take a seat on a hard plastic chair in the back corner, and say nothing. For a man whose voice could command armies of contractors and engineers, his silence was a monumental effort. He listened to them call his tower a blight, a tombstone. He listened to them debate how to spend his money with a mixture of glee and suspicion. He never flinched. He just listened, his face an unreadable mask, absorbing the impact of their words like a seawall absorbing the crash of the waves. The breakthrough came during the third meeting. The debate over the playground had become particularly vicious, pitting the needs of young families against the concerns of older residents about noise. The argument stalled. Clara, desperate, projected one of her sketches onto the wall. It was a simple drawing of an old man sitting on a park bench, watching a group of children play. In his face, she had captured not annoyance, but a deep, wistful loneliness. "This is Mr. Henderson from the 3rd floor of the Elm Street building," she said softly. "He told me he doesn't mind the sound of children playing. He said it reminds him that the world is still moving. The problem isn't the noise. The problem is that there's nowhere for him to sit in the shade and watch." The room fell silent. Suddenly, the argument wasn't about a playground versus a quiet zone. It was about creating a space for both. The idea of an intergenerational park was born, one with a state-of-the-art play structure and quiet, shaded chess tables. They had stopped fighting over resources and started designing for people. After the meeting, as people were filing out, Maria the baker approached Alistair, who was still sitting in his corner. It was the first time any of them had dared to speak to him directly. "That drawing," she said, gesturing to the screen. "The girl, Clara, she sees things. You were right to listen to her." Alistair looked at the formidable old woman. "She sees things I was trained to ignore," he admitted. Maria nodded. Then a sly look came into her eyes. "You know, we are designing a new community kitchen. We will need a structural engineer to look at the plans. A volunteer, of course." Julian Croft took a half-step forward, ready to politely decline on Alistair's behalf. But Alistair raised a hand, stopping him. He looked at Maria, and a strange, long-forgotten light flickered in his eyes. It wasn't the fire of ambition. It was the quiet spark of a builder who has just been handed a challenging new blueprint. "Send me the plans," Alistair Finch said. A year passed. The Helios Plaza was no longer a plaza. It was a living room. The vast, wind-swept granite was now a mosaic of life. A vibrant farmer's market spilled out from one corner. The intergenerational park was a riot of laughter and quiet contemplation. Movable planters, designed by a local artist, allowed the space to be reconfigured daily. There was a small stage where a jazz trio played on weekends. The air smelled not of curated sterility, but of grilled corn, fresh flowers, and coffee. It was messy. It was imperfect. It was alive. Clara's office, a small, sun-drenched space in a renovated brick building, overlooked this beautiful chaos. Her walls were covered not with charts and financial projections, but with her portraits of the community. They were her board of directors, her constant reminder of what and who she was working for. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was sitting on a bench, sketching a new fountain the trust had just installed, when a familiar shadow fell over her page. Alistair sat down beside her. He was wearing a worn tweed jacket that looked suspiciously like something Julian would choose. The severe architectural lines of his posture had softened. He watched the scene for a long time, his eyes taking in the details. A child had drawn a massive, lopsided hopscotch court in chalk on the granite pavers he had personally selected for their flawless uniformity. A vendor's cart was leaking a small, sticky puddle of watermelon juice near the base of the magnificent steel sculpture. "It's structurally compromised," he said, his voice completely deadpan. Clara smiled without looking up from her sketchbook. "It's a disaster. The pedestrian flow is completely inefficient. The acoustic baffling is non-existent," he added, "and the color palette is an assault on the senses." He pointed to a cracked paving stone near her feet. "And that," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, "is a clear sign of foundational instability, a flaw." "I know," Clara said, finally looking at him. "Isn't it wonderful?" His smile became real. It was a small, quiet thing, but it reached his eyes, erasing the last of the shadows. He wasn't the hurricane anymore. He was the quiet after the storm. He looked at her sketchbook, at the half-finished drawing of the fountain, full of motion and life. "My father," he said, his voice soft. He didn't want to build bridges. He wanted to be a cabinet maker. He loved the feel of the wood, the joinery, the small, human-scaled things. He took the engineering job because it was stable, because he had a family. He paused, looking back at the plaza. He would have liked this place, this beautiful, inefficient, chaotic mess. It was the first time he had spoken of his father with anything other than pain. The ghost of the fallen bridge had finally been laid to rest, not by building something perfect, but by embracing the beauty of the imperfect. Clara closed her sketchbook. She had filled this one, and dozens more before it. They were her true blueprints, the plans for a world built not of steel and glass, but of empathy and understanding. They sat in comfortable silence, two architects watching their creation. He, the master of the monolith, had learned the strength in surrender. She, the quiet observer, had learned the power in her own voice. They hadn't built a building. They had built a bridge, not of steel, but of trust, spanning the vast gulf between a penthouse in the sky and a bakery on a sunlit street. And they both knew, without having to say a word, that this was the only kind of structure that was truly built to last.